Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning to provide this Honorable House with a half-year report on the government's fiscal performance. Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to have a material impact on the Bermuda economy and the government's fiscal position. However, significant work has been done by government and the community to combat this virus and adapt to the new normal. As the half-year results highlight, the ongoing work and actions taken to date have had some positive results. The headline numbers for the 2021-2022 national budget are a revenue target of $998.9 million, current expenditure of $1.03 billion, including debt service, capital expenditures of $92.9 million, and a projected deficit of $124.7 million. Mr. Speaker, total revenues for the first half of fiscal 2021-22 are $503.5 million, $40.7 million or 8.8% above September 2020, and broadly in line with the budget. This is mainly due to higher custom duty receipts, along with minor increases in payroll tax collections and stamp duties. Of significance, Mr. Speaker, is the following. Customs duties are up by $25.9 million versus the first half of the 2020-2021 fiscal year and 7% above budget. Payroll taxes were up by $6 million when compared to the same period last year and were on budget. Stamp duties were up by $7.3 million and 27% above budget. Other receipts were 15% below budget, with passenger taxes and transportation infrastructure tax receipts for the period reduced to almost negligible levels. Overall, due to the steady improvement in areas of the economy, the revenue collections in the second quarter of this year are generally tracking on budget. Mr. Speaker, current expenditures, excluding debt service for the period ending September 30, 2021, are $50 million or 11% lower than when compared to the 6 months ended September 2020. Key factors included lower expenditures for the COVID-19 pandemic and unemployment benefits for this fiscal year when compared to 2020-2021. In addition, there were positive impacts from the austerity measures put in place last year to mitigate, to some extent, the devastating effects that the pandemic was having on the economy. Mr. Speaker, the highlights in relation to expenditures are as follows. Salaries and wages were down by $17.1 million, or 4% below budget, and employer overhead was down by $7.4 million, or 11% below budget. These reductions reflect the critical cost control measures put in place in the summer of 2020, which concluded in August of 2021. Seller-related spend was also reduced by existing vacancies in the public sector. During this period, the government spent $20.7 million in COVID-19 related expenditures, of which $9.2 million was for unemployment and supplemental benefits. We've also spent just over $11.5 million for other COVID-related matters to keep Bermuda safe and secure. The overall spend in this regard, although lower than the corresponding period in 2020-2021, has already exceeded the total estimated funding for the whole of this fiscal year. Costs incurred include the following: COVID-19 testing, contract tracing, vaccine administration, call center operation, and travel authorization management, $7.8 million. Molecular diagnostic lab operations, $2 million. And spend related to the quarantine mandate of $1.7 million. Also during this period, the government has incurred additional expenditures of $8.6 million, which relate to significant government guarantee commitments made under the previous administration. This includes $7.6 million expenditure for the first quarter of the airport revenue guarantee and $1 million in consultancy costs for Morgan's Point, Caroline Bay. These expenditures are anticipated to increase during the remainder of the 2021-22 fiscal year and to have a further negative impact on the government's fiscal position. Overall, Notwithstanding the COVID-19 impact and the additional revenues, additional guarantee-related expenditures, current expenditures, excluding debt service, are presently in line with the original annual estimate of $903 million at $456.7 million for the half year. This highlights that the prudent and considered measures put in place in 2020, which have been continually monitored for effectiveness, have played a positive role in protecting the economy from further devastating damage. It is recognized that, in certain instances, expenditures are not made evenly over the year, and therefore may distort actuals when compared to budget. Further, with the expectation of continuing increases in COVID-related expenditure and certain other necessary costs, we continue to carefully evaluate the fiscal position and will, as necessary, take steps to limit expenditure where possible. Interest expenses and related facility fees are tracking in line with 2020 performance, notwithstanding the fact that the government undertook additional borrowing last summer. Additional capital of $1.35 billion, which was raised in August of 2020, was able to be financed at historically lower rates than existing debt. Mr. Speaker, I would also highlight that all of the government's capital raise of $1.35 billion was to provide funding for the government and its anticipated economic recovery over the next 2 to 3 years. Mr. Speaker, excluding debt service, the government recorded a $21.1 million current account surplus for the first 6 months of the year, compared to a $71.4 million deficit in 2020. The all-inclusive deficit was $43.3 million compared to a projected deficit of $135.8 million in 2020. The deficit was financed by the above referenced capital raise. Mr. Speaker, gross debt at the end of September 2021 remains at $3.35 billion, and net of sinking fund balances, the debt was $3.05 billion. Mr. Speaker, I would like to advise that the Ministry of Finance is currently finalizing its detailed assessment of the 2021-22 mid-year performance. This mid-year review will provide the revised estimates of revenue and expenditure for fiscal 2021-22, along with economic data and actions required to remain within the 2021-2022 budget deficit of $124.7 million. I intend to report back to the House later in this session the updated 2021-22 revised estimates of revenue and expenditure. Mr. Speaker, it is imperative that the budget deficit target for fiscal 2021-2022 is not exceeded, given the current high level of public debt. The Ministry of Finance regards any breach of the deficit target to be a serious issue, as continuous increases in the deficit and debt levels will likely negatively impact Bermuda's credit rating and the cost of refinancing government debt in the future. In this regard, we would again note that over the next 24 months, nearly $1 billion of debt will have to be refinanced. Therefore, it is important that we continue to ensure that fiscal matters are managed in a prudent and considered way, and that we adhere to our commitments to balancing the budget by 2023-24. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I must remind all that we should continue to work together to successfully progress our lives beyond this pandemic and to ensure that there is a sustained and shared economic recovery for our country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.